Hello, theory students. So, as promised, I am doing a review for exam 3. Alright? So, this is what we're going to do. Unpacking all these intricate theories. It's been eating up a lot of memory and crashing my computer, and so I've been having a hard time getting the theory lectures to work. That's something, it's a part of this transitionary process moving to online. But I know that you all are good students. The readings are available to you. And the closer we get to the more contemporary social theorists, the easier it should be for you to understand the language they're using and how they're talking. The first thing we're going to start off, we're going to go in order of how you should have done the readings according to the syllabus. So, and keep in mind, this is not comprehensive over these theorists by any stretch of the imagination. I'm merely focusing in on the areas in the readings where the most questions have been generated for the exam, as well as things that I would have told you in lecture about the lives of the theorists and their general, the controversies surrounding them and what have you. One thing I would recommend strongly for all of my students to do, this is more than a recommendation, this is more of a requirement. You really should do more than just the readings with this new online format, because we're not interacting as much as we were if we were on campus. You can't just come to my office and sit down and talk with me about the theories. So, with that in mind, you need to be looking up the concepts that are posted for you in the key terms and concepts page for exam 3. When you find a term that is not in the readings, once you've done the readings, you've gone through it and you can't find it in there, that might be a term that I put in the list just to help you gain more context and greater understanding of the readings. So use the key terms and concepts. This is what I do with my straight online course. I tell the students in there, use the list to then look up the most important terms that I've already pulled out for you. Then go make sure you're going to academic sites. Wikipedia can be good for just a general idea, but I wouldn't rely on it. Wikipedia is not entirely trustworthy. But anything that's like .edu, the web address ends with .edu, is most likely going to be trustworthy and good. And so I would strongly recommend going and looking through this. Also, where a lot of the readings are housed in that Marxist.org page that is in the syllabus, which I don't even know why they call it Marxist.org. There's so many theorists that are archived on that website who are not Marxist at all. I mean, they have symbolic interactionists, they have structural functionalists. It should just be called socialtheory.org, but they call it, whoever did it up did it as Marxist.org. So anyways, with this bit of housekeeping stuff being said, on that website, I didn't finish my thought. On that website, there are a lot of resources that you can use as well, such as glossaries. You can type some of the terms directly from the key terms and concept lists that I provide into the glossary part or the index part of Marxist.org, and you can end up finding many of the concepts, not all of them. So, let me go ahead and jump into the review. We're going to be starting with Friedrich Nietzsche. And the first thing we want to start off with is something that most people misunderstand about his philosophy, but that most people are at least aware that he wrote these words. He famously wrote that God is dead. Now, this has been incredibly misunderstood throughout since Nietzsche's life. You have to keep in mind that Nietzsche doesn't believe in a god or gods or devils or spirits or anything like that, or souls. He is very much rooted in material philosophy, though he is not someone who's going out and gaining or gathering strictly empirical evidence. He focuses more on what is called etymology, etymology. It's a study of language and the history of language. This is something I brought up in class. And so, what did Nietzsche mean by writing God is dead? Well, since he didn't actually believe in any god or gods, you cannot understand him literally. And that's one of the biggest problems, is that people, if you try to read Nietzsche literally, you're going to misunderstand him. He's highly metaphoric, and he's highly self-referential. He references his own philosophy, and to really get a good grasp of what Nietzsche's talking about, you've got to read at least most of Nietzsche's works, and you'll start to see how he's referencing himself back and forth, and of course other theorists and philosophers that we've talked about and that we're going to continue talking about. So, what did he mean then? Well, he wasn't saying that anything had literally died. What he was saying was that most people who profess to be religious are hypocritical in their religious beliefs, that they'll profess a label, like I am this religion or that religion, but that then they don't actually put the values of that religion into action, or they will cherry pick which values of that religion they'll put into values, or they'll put into action, I mean. And so he argued that the birth of the scientific revolution and science becoming the dominant epistemology as far as how the West comes to know the world, that most people no longer truly, literally, authentically believe the religions they profess as, but continue in them as convention, tradition, it makes them feel good, what have you. And so that's what he means by the death of God. He means that people have ceased truly believing in God. He is not saying this in any kind of celebratory way, actually. Nietzsche is kind of does a eulogy for God, so to speak, in his work Thus Spake Zarathustra, and particularly the story of the parable of the madman. Something you might want to look up just to get some context for it. All right, so in the readings that were assigned for you out of his classic, The Genealogy of Morals, he's tracing where current morality for Western culture comes from. And he's arguing that there are two separate moral codes. There's good versus bad and good versus evil. And he sees those as being two very different moral codes. Good versus bad, he sees as being before what he calls the slave revolt in morality. By slave revolt in morality, he's talking about some metaphoric incident. He's not picking a particular revolt that occurred in ancient times. He's talking about a slow change over time in the way cultures thought about morality. So, in Good versus Bad, which he calls barbarian morality, he argues that it's ultimately a healthier moral code, but it's grossly oversimplified. And so, with Good versus Bad, or barbarian morality, this is before the slave revolt morality. Nietzsche argued that that occurred over 2,000 years ago and was the replacement of barbarian morality with what he calls the ascetic ideal. All right. Now, when he's talking about slave revolt morality, he's not talking about literal slaves. Again, he's highly metaphoric. He's talking about religious priests or religious authority figures, depending on which ancient society you're looking at, and how they were considered kind of second class to the warrior castes within ancient societies. And yet today we end up seeing the priestly caste or the priestly classes having more status across cultures than what we would see in warriors or soldiers or what have you. He points, for instance, to the way that good and bad break down in terms of language, and how literal the barbarian morality would be. So, for instance, if you were called impure in Good versus Bad, that meant you needed to go bathe. And it had no more deeper meaning than that. It was also something, it was a moral code that was relative. So you might act badly on the battlefield in a moral sense by showing fear and running away. But then you're not then always a coward and always rejected, because if you go onto the battlefield the next day and you show courage and bravery, then that can undo the judgment prior, and now you're thought of as being good. Whereas Good versus Evil is an absolutist moral code. It's not something that you can change. So that's why I think about when you're talking with a child, you might say, you are being bad right now, or you're acting badly right now, but you don't look at a child and say, you're evil. I mean, that's very absolutist. And so he says that while the problem with Good versus Evil is that it is absolute in its moral judgments. So if you're considered evil, you're always evil. If you're considered good, you're always good. But at the same point in time, he argues that Good versus Evil gave humanity depth, that it made us think more metaphorically, more symbolically. As he writes, and I paraphrase, the slave revolt and morality finally made humanity interesting. All right. Now, I've mentioned this before, but key to Nietzsche's philosophy is actually found, the idea is found originally in the German idealist Arthur Schopenhauer. You may remember how I discussed Schopenhauer was teaching at one point at the same school as Hegel, and he would schedule his lectures at the same time as Hegel's lectures, and that Schopenhauer couldn't stand Hegel, but Hegel barely knew who Schopenhauer was. Well, Nietzsche found Schopenhauer far more influential, far more interesting, In much of the same way that Marx found Hegel interesting and Weber found Kant interesting. But coming from Arthur Schopenhauer's concept of the will. Now this is something, again, I've mentioned before, but it's very important to understand as a part of, it's kind of part of the backbone of Nietzsche's philosophy and his theoretical stance as well. And so will in this way is kind of like how physicists talk about force. It's not a matter of consciousness, but a matter of trajectory. So, for instance, if a comet is headed towards Earth, then in Schopenhauerian language, we would say the comet's will is to hit the Earth. Does that mean that the comet is consciously thinking of going to hit the Earth? No, not at all. They're not engaging in this kind of animism or spiritualism where they're saying that everything's alive, including the rocks. The hills are alive with the sound of the waves. Anyway. So, what about consciousness then? Because how does consciousness form? Well, as for Schopenhauer, so too for Nietzsche. Nietzsche argues that consciousness is mere illusion. We do not actually make conscious choices. That most of what we do is actually predetermined. And it's determined ultimately by the will to power. Now, the will to power is multiple. You have to understand it in terms of multiplicity. It's not just a single thing. The will to power is something that could be summed up as your will to survive, your will to thrive. It could be understood in the sense of being expressed every time you eat or drink something. It's expressing will to power over that thing that you are now consuming and forcing to become a part of your own body and your own life. He sees us as being a bundle of wills, and those wills at times conflict with one another. But wills are kind of based in their own wills to power. So different wills have different amounts of power than other wills. And so the example I used in class, for instance, is say you are lying in bed and you've got class to go to, and your alarm clock's going off, and you had a late night, so you're still really tired, and you hit the snooze button, and it seems like just a second later the alarm's going off again. And so you've got a couple of wills competing with each other. You have the will to turn the alarm clock off and just go back to sleep and skip class. You have the will to force yourself out of bed and get ready and go to class. And these two wills are clashing with one another. Now, typically, I'm using an overly simplistic example. Typically, we have more than just two wills clashing. Things are far more complicated in application than that. But I'm oversimplifying just so make sure that you understand the concept. So, in this sense, then, you experience a choice. Whether you turn the alarm clock off and go back to sleep, or you get up and force yourself to get ready and go to class. Either way, you've experienced yourself as making a choice or a series of choices. Nietzsche would say that's the illusion, that you never made any choices whatsoever, that what will was going to win out was predetermined by whichever will was strongest in that moment. And here's the thing about that. It's not determinism in any large-scale kinds of things. Nietzschean determinism is far more complicated than just everything is laid out and predetermined. He's not doing Calvin's theology or Luther's theology. He's not doing predestination here. So he would say that it's not necessarily predetermined which will is going to have the most power, but whichever will has the most power will determine what gets expressed, and you don't really have a choice in it. It's kind of similar to Nietzsche's quote that you will always become that which you already are. Very similar kind of concept. All right. Now, Nietzsche saw people as tending to lock themselves in absolutist and very rigid worldviews. I mean, I've been teaching on the collegiate level since 2006, so I've, over the years, had a lot of students. And I see this sometimes. I mean, you get the students who are open-minded, who are not wanting to get locked into a certain perspective, who want to learn all these different perspectives. And then you get students who think that they have already got the whole world figured out by the time they're 18. And they've got the answer to everything. And it's typically these very overly simplistic, black and white kind of, it's either this or that, these rigid and absolutist worldviews. And, well, I'll give you an example. I had a student who, this was years ago, would constantly refuse to come to theory class, refuse to do the readings. And they thought that I was trying to indoctrinate them. And I finally, after the second time of the person failing the class, the person came to me and I looked at them and I said, do you even know which of these theorists are my favorite, which ones I think speak most to me? And the student thought for a minute and said, no, actually I don't. And I said, exactly. I teach them all equally because they are all equally important. Their perspectives are important. And they're disagreeing with one another. And so when I teach this stuff, I'm teaching it from the theorist perspective. I still had a hard time with that student. I mean, you saw a light bulb moment, and then they went back to their old way of doing things. They finally passed the class, I will say that though. So, maybe I got through. I certainly would hope so. Now, here's the thing though. Nietzsche argues that most people are locked in these rigid absolutist worldviews, and that it becomes problematic. And we can see how that occurs when suddenly the real world crashes in and forces us to face ideology that's just simply not working, or can only work in certain contexts. Such as all the misinformation you hear about COVID-19, and you see people out grocery shopping not wearing masks to protect themselves and to protect other people. It's not just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting others too. But anyways, so the virus is crashing in on their ideology is what I'm saying there. Now, Nietzsche sees humanity breaking into three basic types, and really two types. So it's one of these things you can imagine Nietzsche saying there's only two types of people in this world, after just saying don't become overly simplistic, right? But he sees this as not an either or kind of thing, but something people can move between. And he likes using animal metaphors. So he uses two metaphors. One, the camels. The other one, the blonde beast of prey. Now, a lot has been made about him using the term blonde beast of prey. And his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, rewrote a lot of his works and highlighted that aspect of his philosophy and tried to make it sound like he was talking about some Aryan group that existed, and then Nietzsche's sister presented Nietzsche's works to Hitler, and Hitler unfortunately makes the statement that if you want to understand his ideology, you need to read Nietzsche and listen to the music of Richard Wagner. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche would never have agreed with Nazism whatsoever. There were ideas along those lines that were floating around in his own lifetime, and he openly denounced them. Oh, he called prejudice and racism and these kinds of things a sickness of will. He wrote an essay collected in the book The Twilight of Idols called What We Germans Lack. And he goes after the concept of German nationalism and is very critical of the concept of German nationalism. Which, as I hope you all know, is at the very root of the Nazi ideology. So, he talks about the blonde beast of prey, but he means lions. He's thinking about an animal, not about a human animal. He's thinking about a big cat. Now, here's what he said: that camels are the majority of humanity, and that the majority will simply bear all things. Will simply, they're pack animals, beasts of burden. They'll go along with whatever the dominant worldviews or ideologies are. They won't question them. They'll do what they're told, and obedience is a value and a virtue to them. So, the lions, however, the blonde beasts of prey, are destructive. They will tear down old philosophies. They will tear down old values. They'll question things. But oftentimes, no, not oftentimes, this was actually the criticism that Nietzsche had about lions, is that lions don't create anything new. All they do is destroy others' perspectives by poking holes in them and showing logical fallacies and what have you. And so he sees the blonde beast of prey as being destructive without any ability to create. Now, this enters into his concept of the Übermensch, or the Overman. It's been translated as the Superman, but that's a mistranslation. It's the Overman. Uber means over. And he means it as the one who overcomes humanity itself, the flaws of humanity. He sees humanity as a potential, not as a final end, but as a transition to something much greater. And so, whether this is, he meant it in an evolutionary way, that's doubtful. More he was thinking in terms of the ability to embrace multiplicity and multiple thinking in multiple terms. Now, the Übermensch, the image he uses for the Overman is the playful child. The one who can play with perspectives the way a child plays with a ball. And so he sees this. Nietzsche is very playful himself, but he argues there are no Übermensches. There are no Overmen. He's saying that he's heralding the coming of the Übermensch, even though no one has actually achieved such a thing. So he doesn't think he's an Übermensch. And also there is no the Übermensch. He's not talking about, he's not creating this kind of savior philosophy type of thing. He's talking about a transition to a new way of thinking, as I said. So the biggest characteristic of the Übermensch that you need to understand is playfulness. This concept of play. Playing with perspectives, playing with ideas, playing with concepts, not getting locked into any one thing. Now, he's not saying go through your life not knowing anything. He's not embracing this kind of radical Socratic ignorance, We can know certain things, just don't assume you know everything about anything, because there's always more. All right. As Shakespeare put it, and I'll paraphrase because I can't remember the exact quote, there's more under heaven, in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy. Right? Now, Nietzsche is both critical of warrior and priestly morality. Now keep in mind, priestly morality is the ascetic ideal. It's good versus evil as well. Now, while he criticizes the warrior morality or barbarian morality for being too simplistic and too literal, it represents an externalized will to power. So, for instance, if somebody living under the warrior morality, good versus bad, if they feel like they were wronged by someone else, they would just go and attack that person or attack that other village or what have you, and then they'd be done with it. That would be their pound of flesh. Things are equalized now. Things have reached harmony. For the ascetic priests, or those operating under the ascetic ideal, that is considered immoral. So instead, they internalize the will to power instead of externalizing it. And then they end up reacting, Nietzsche calls this a sick will to power, through ressentiment. Now, Nietzsche keeps it in the French, ressentiment, but it literally would translate as resentment. Now, when Nietzsche is talking about ressentiment, he is talking about this obsessing over something someone's done to you, doing little things to try to annoy them, trying to use policy or bureaucracy to get at them, to get your revenge in an indirect sort of way. But because you never feel like you've actually been able to get your revenge or express yourself, nothing ever feels good enough. And so you're always just eaten up with this bad conscience and thinking about this other person or other people in general. And so the main emotional source, according to Nietzsche, for priestly morality or the ascetic ideal is ressentiment. That is the emotional source for it. Resentment. All right. Now, that will, if you can understand those concepts that I just went through, and you go and look through them in the readings, you should do just fine on the section of the exam dealing with Nietzsche. So, now let's turn our attention to the next person in line that you should have read, who was Thorstein Veblen. Now, Veblen is a sociologist, whereas Nietzsche is considered a philosopher. However, Nietzsche was very influential in sociology. You can even see Weber and Durkheim referencing Nietzsche. Weber will actually name Nietzsche, whereas Durkheim, you have to have read Nietzsche to understand who he's having an argument with, because he'll just refer to him as like the German philosopher, a German philosopher, and he won't even put Nietzsche's name. But if you have studied Nietzsche, you know that Durkheim is being highly critical of Nietzsche, particularly where Nietzsche does his analysis of religion. Durkheim deeply disagrees with Nietzsche on that, particularly where Nietzsche says that the basis of all religion is fear, and fear of the unknown, fear of dying, fear of an uncertain world, and Durkheim argues actually that the first notion of spirits were as helpers. They were not things that people were afraid of. that they were protectors, yes, but they also gave people power over the world through culture. And so Durkheim basically says that Nietzsche's being overly simplistic in his analysis of religion. But anyways, back to Veblen. Veblen was influenced by Nietzsche, particularly Nietzsche's concepts of power. We'll also see that Nietzsche was very influential to postmodern and post-structural thinkers like Michel Foucault, Jean Baudrillard, but we haven't gotten to them yet. So we'll stick a pin in them. Back to Veblen. Veblen is also influenced by conflict theory more generally. And so he's a cultural critic, and he's looking at American culture in particular. And he is asking, why is it that we give the highest social rewards to those who contribute the least to society, and we give the least rewards to those who contribute the most? So, Veblen is very much interested in this question of class and status. So, for instance, why do we give the billionaire jet setter so much status, and they get a platform on any major news network that they want, anytime they want, just because their status is a billionaire? And yet people who save countless lives through preventative measures like sanitation workers are looked down upon as a low status kind of job, and are typically not paid much at all. And yet you've got billionaire party types who are, trust fund babies who haven't done a day of work in their lives, and they end up having high status and high class position, and people listen to them. And then people who have been working their entire lives tirelessly just to help others are looked down upon it. And Veblen saw a moral problem in the way that our society functions in this way, and the way our culture supports it. So you can see also the influence of Weber on Veblen. And in particular, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. In many ways, what Veblen is doing is extending Weber's analysis of the spirit of capitalism further. Now, here's another thing that you have to keep in mind, though, in this regard, is that when Veblen is talking about this stuff, he's talking about things like conspicuous consumption, right? Now, if you remember your Weber argues that the spirit of capitalism has people hoarding money, and that's how it accumulates into capital for then reinvestment. So you end up sacrificing your life not for some ascetic ideal necessarily, but for economic rationalism to get as much money as possible, but then you don't spend that money because the money becomes capital and becomes an end in and of itself, whereas other people and anything in the world is merely a means to that end. And so this is a flipping of morality, a reevaluation of values that Weber's talking about. So you can see Nietzsche's influence on Weber in this regard. Now with Veblen, he's looking at conspicuous consumption, or how people get status by going out and buying really expensive things and then showing them off. You can see this like on Instagram when people are showing off things that they're unwrapping presents, or they're unwrapping packages and describing them and things like this. This is a kind of conspicuous consumption. So you say, well, how do we go from saving like crazy under the Protestant work ethic with Weber to spending like crazy under Veblen? Well, the transitionary period occurred during the Gilded Age, period of around 1890s up to the 1920s. And Veblen was alive during this time period and active. Weber himself, Weber and Durkheim both died during this time period. But Veblen was kind of in his prime writing about this stuff. So, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism is still in work. The issue is that it's only occurring at the upper echelons. So in other words, most people don't have enough money to let it accumulate into capital for investment for business purposes to end up accruing more money. The best most of us can do is put things aside for retirement, where we might have enough money by the time we're 70, maybe if we're lucky, or in a savings account that has a very low interest rate. But the only people who are even able to continue to accumulate capital are those at the very top of the class hierarchy. And so the rest of us have to look at money in a more traditional way as a means to an end. And most Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So, let's get into some of this more in depth. Veblen argues that part of the reason why people in lower class positions will go into debt is because of how status now works and what is a rising consumer society. Now, we have not yet, in Veblen's day, become a consumer society, but we're certainly on the path in that direction, particularly with the nouveau riche, or what Veblen calls the leisure class. And so keep in mind that with Veblen, he's focusing mainly on the nouveau riche. But remember that the upper class breaks down into two basic categories. And there's more, but there's a lot more complexity to the class system in America than just this. But if we were to break the upper class into two overarching camps, it would be old money, or those that have been wealthy for generations, and new money, where people have become wealthy relatively recently, and it could be just within a couple of generations. So Veblen argues that American culture is set up where each class tries to emulate, and he calls it pecuniary emulation. Now, pecuniary is merely a reference to finances, and so you're trying to spin like you're in a class above you so that you can get that status, and you won't get the disrespect from other people of being in a lower class position. So this is one of the main driving reasons why Veblen, if he were alive today, would say that most Americans are drowning in so much debt. But also because the dollar is simply not stretching as far. Now, this doesn't mean that people in lower socioeconomic status positions are trying to pecuniarily emulate the class at the very top. I mean, you don't have somebody who's in the working class who is trying to live like Elon Musk, for instance. You just don't see that. But what you see is each class position tries to emulate the class just above it. Now, it's also important to understand that emulation is not the same as imitation. Imitation, you're just copying someone. Emulation, you want to be that person. So lower classes are not just imitating higher classes, they want to be the higher class, which makes sense. People are wanting upward mobility. And so if they can't actually get upward mobility, they'll settle for this kind of emulation. Now, all taste cultures all start or are founded by old money. Old money ends up setting the taste standard. And then new money, or the nouveau riche, the leisure class, ends up taking it to an extreme. Whereas old money might be a little more understated, the nouveau riche, Veblen criticizes as being gaudy, tacky. They take things to extremes, to these kind of pornographic levels. They can't just be happy with a certain amount. It has to be constantly bigger, better, more. And so then you see that filters down. So then the upper middle class is emulating the nouveau riche and so on. But whereas, say, the middle class person might be emulating the nouveau riche person who has Peruvian marble with gold veins inlaid throughout, and get just a regular old, more closely sourced marble to put down in their kitchens. And then, say, somebody in the working class might get linoleum that then looks like marble, or tries to look like marble. So you see how that ends up filtering down. And that's how Veblen sees pecuniary emulation. All right. Now, this is just a statement. Veblen goes through, because he is turning 19th century anthropology and their notion of cultural evolution on its head. And so this is rejected by anthropologists, by sociologists, social scientists in general today. But in the 1800s, in the 19th century, anthropologists in Europe and the US, and Canada, and the Western world in general, thought that cultures moved from what they called primitive to savage to barbarian to civilized, with only Western society being the actual civilized part, reaching civilized, and all other human groups somehow fall in barbarian, savage, or primitive. And typically how it broke down is that primitives were, that label, that term was typically used for societies in Africa, in South America. Savage was typically used for the tribes, the Native American tribes in North America. Barbarian, it was interesting, it was used for Asia, parts of Asia, as well as Europe's own tribal past. So even Europe's tribal past wasn't considered in Western civilization's mind in the 1800s as being savage or primitive. No, they were barbarians, so they were one step from being civilized, right? Not to mention that this whole thing is actually much older than the 19th century. It dates all the way back to ancient Rome, where ancient Romans saw themselves as civilized and everyone who was not Roman as barbarian. And that was how they understood the world, is you're either Roman or a barbarian. And you can see how that language then got passed down to the descendants of the very people that were labeled by the ancient Romans as being barbarians. But anyway, I mean, when Caesar's conquering Gaul, he's not saying, "Oh, look at how civilized these Visigoths and Ostrogoths are." Anyway, so Veblen argues that the original concept of private property begins in the same way that marriage, or the concept of marriage, begins as ownership of women. And he sees women as being the first form of private property. And there's anthropological data to back him up on this. At this point in time, the idea was that if you were going to go and raid another tribe, you would take women from the other tribe, and then they would become wives or concubines or what have you. And in many cases, the more women you had as a warrior, a man, the higher status you were in many societies around the world. Now, there are exceptions to this, and there have been in the past matriarchal societies where obviously this would not be the case in women-dominated societies. Now, Veblen also argued that people using their possessions to show off is nothing new. It's just that conspicuous consumption is taken to an entirely new level in the Gilded Age and beyond. And so it's the degree of consumption, not that consumption is occurring, because of course consumption has always been a part of the overall economic equation, dating back to ancient economies. And so it's a question of degree. Now, going also extending the concept of how women are the first form of private property, we also see the concept of vicarious consumption. This would be where you would have a well-to-do man who might be jokingly complaining about his wife's spending habits. It's like, oh yeah, the other day she went into Tiffany's and dropped $10,000 on my credit card. And just the week before she dropped 20. Now, what is the person communicating with that? Are they really saying, like, my wife's spending habits are going to make us homeless? No. What they're saying is they're bragging. It's like, oh, see, I'm such a rich and powerful man that even though I wish you weren't so frivolous, got to get a little bit of misogyny in there. At the same point in time, I'm rich enough to pay it. I have a credit card where you can put $10,000 or $20,000 on it, and so it's bragging, and it's gaining reflected status because of the behavior of someone else. That's vicarious. And so Veblen calls this vicarious consumption. Veblen also argues that there's a double standard in terms of how the wealthy versus how the poor are judged. So say that somebody who is homeless has a bottle of wine in a brown paper bag and is drinking it somewhere, and people passing by are looking at the person. And most likely they're confusing cause and effect and saying things like, oh, see, well, that's why he's homeless. He's clearly an alcoholic, a wino, or drunk. Isn't that disgusting? Look at that. But then you see a large, plump man sitting in a 5-star luxury restaurant doing snifters of brandy. And their nose is bright red like Rudolph, and it looks like they're going to drop dead of cirrhosis of the liver at any moment. And they might even make a joke or two. It's like, oh yes, cirrhosis only reached a part of my liver so far. I can still enjoy myself. Now that person is not considered a drunk or an alcoholic or a wino. That person's considered a connoisseur, right? Same behavior, drinking for whatever reason, but at the same point in time, if the rich do it, it's judged differently than if the poor do it. All right. Now, this can also lead to this, what Veblen sees as truly an absurd kind of thing, like that he calls diseases of indulgence. Now, diseases of indulgence are diseases that you typically will get because you've overdone it on something. But because you've been able to overdo it on something means that you have access. And so then that's a reflected status. Now, not all diseases come with status. It depends on what the disease is. And so in the 1800s and into the 1900s, 19th to 20th centuries, gout was considered a gentleman's disease. And the reason is because you have to consume a lot of organ meat and a lot of alcohol and a lot of things that were simply not available to poorer people at the time. Now, that's no longer the case today, but when it comes to gout. But that was what was believed at that point in time. And so if you got gout, that was considered high status. There's actually an episode, if you have Netflix and you're looking for a show to watch, Disenchantment is pretty funny, and there's an episode where the king of this mythical land is really jealous of this other rich nobleman who has developed gout, and so he orders his servants to, he just lies in bed and orders his servants to bring him all of this sausage and all of these rich meats and organ meats and all of these drinks, and he lies in bed and gorges himself until he develops gout, so that he could compete with this other aristocrat. I mean, it's exactly what Veblen's talking about, but it's a very funny kind of way of depicting it. All right. Now, connected to conspicuous consumption is conspicuous leisure. Now, remember, he calls the Nouveau Riche leisure class. So, those pictures that people are posting on social media all the time of themselves not doing work, but constantly on vacation or constantly partying or anything along those lines, would all fall within what he's talking about in terms of conspicuous leisure. It's not enough that you have leisure time, you have to show off how much leisure time you have in order to gain status. Then we have also conspicuous waste tied to conspicuous consumption, so that the more that you waste, the higher the status you can be seen as having as well. And we will play status games by showing how much we can waste. I'll give you an example. Say that you've got somebody throwing a party at 1 week, and so you go to the party and the music's turned down real low, and you don't want to disturb the neighbors, and the person's running around with coasters. No, don't set your drink on there without a coaster. Make sure you're using a coaster. And nobody get rough or rowdy or anything like that. Let's just sit and talk. And now, that actually doesn't sound too bad to me. My partying days are behind me. But would you really want to go to that person's party the next time they throw one? Most likely not, especially not younger people. But if somebody's throwing a raucous party and the music's blaring, and I mean, I've heard people say, well, it's not a good party unless the police have been there at least twice. Their things are getting destroyed as people are, doing impromptu mosh pits in the living room. Now, people go out of that saying, wow, that was a good party. The other one's saying, I'm not going back to that person. That person's boring. But what ended up happening in the second party that didn't happen in the first? Waste, destruction. And so that was a part of what Veblen's talking about, and it's not something that just the wealthy do. It's something, again, because of pecuniary emulation that filters down through the class structure. All right. Now, I meant to say when I was talking about how Western society, Western culture, in the 19th century and into the 20th century had this ranking order in terms of cultures and societies, I said Veblen's turning that on its head. Here's how he does it. He refers to Western culture as not being civilized, but being barbarous. And then he refers to it as a predatory culture. He sees all of this as being a kind of like Nietzsche, the internalized will to power. You can't externalize it because then you'll go to prison for theft or assault or something like that. But you internalize it, and then you play these status games to try to dominate others. And so we can see Nietzsche's influence on Veblen's thinking here in terms of power very clearly. So he calls it predatory culture. Predatory culture. Um, and he says that you can see this in terms of the very wealthy when they will have servants. Now, this is something that you would find more in Veblen's day than you would today, because the upper class don't typically have huge bodies of servants like they did in 100 years ago. But it still illustrates his point in terms of the role of servants when you have people who are servants who are paid to do nothing. Now, remember when we were talking about Marx, and Marx says that the misunderstanding that the classical school of British economics misses is that they think that the bourgeoisie or the wealthy are going to look at the proletariat of the workforce as being like the aristocrats saw their servants. Now, aristocrats saw their servants as being reflections of themselves. And so you wanted to make sure they were well cared for, well dressed, things of that sort, because that meant you were a good lord. And that reflected back on your status. And so you had even more status if you could pay people to just stand around while you ate dinner, and they're not even serving or doing anything. They're just standing there like holding a ceremonial staff while you're eating dinner. No, that means you've really got the power and wealth, right? Well, today though, people don't really have servants in this same way. There are still, you'll find people who will work as servants for the wealthy, but typically it's based on contracts, and so the wealthy aren't necessarily seeing their the help, so to speak, as a reflection of themselves. And so there's no incentive necessarily to do the same thing with an employee. But that would be the role of servants that Veblen is talking about there. All right, now next we're going to move on from Veblen, and we're going to move on to a very important figure in particularly American sociology, and that's W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois was the first African-American man to earn a PhD from Harvard. He was a student of the philosopher William James, remember, one of the big proponents of pragmatism. He also studied abroad in Germany for a period of time and studied directly under Max Weber. Now, we have W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington representing kind of two poles in American thinking in terms of education and in terms of race. And we can see both the influence of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois in how American sociology ended up developing, changing in terms of the study of race and ethnicity. And we can trace kind of two different models. Now, Robert Park is a major figure in 20th century sociology, structural functionalist. He ended up doing a lot of work on race and ethnicity with Booker T. Washington. And they ended up coming up with the race and ethnicity relations model, whereas W.B. Du Bois was far more critical of how race and ethnicity worked in America. And we could trace the thinking of W.B. Du Bois all the way down into what is today called, in contemporary theory, critical race theory. And so W.B. Du Bois was also instrumental in developing a uniquely American school of sociology. Because at this point in time, you had mostly Europeans who were constructing sociology. Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Europeans. Even Veblen was, he was first generation Norwegian immigrant, Norwegian American. So, Du Bois is the first uniquely American sociologist and sociological voice that we end up getting. So, Du Bois and Washington had a disagreement. Now, they had a lot of respect for one another as scholars, as activists, but Washington thought that most people should get a technical education, learn a trade, and go and work. But that a tenth of the population, the talented tenth, should go and get a classical education and go on to graduate school and things like that. Now, W.B. Du Bois thinks that a classical education is important for everyone to get, at least to a certain level. He's not saying everyone needs to go on and get a PhD, and that some people don't need to learn a trade, no doubt, certainly. But at the same point in time, it's important to know history. It's important to know kind of the basics of philosophy. It's important to know how to write, how to analyze something you've read critically. And that these are the skills that everyone needs to have if you're going to be an active participant in any kind of democratic republic. And so, in this sense, classical education is necessary, at least to a degree, for everyone, is what Du Bois argued. Now, Du Bois, in the readings that were assigned to you, ends up introducing a very influential concept called the veil of race. Now, the veil of race is basically the idea that because race has been such a fundamental concept in American culture, dating all the way back to the European colonies in North America, we end up seeing that it is it veils or shrouds every interaction. And I've had students raise their hand when I've taught Du Bois in the past and say, well, all my friends are of the same race as me, so race is not really present in my life. And my answer to that is, well, if all of your friends are the same race as you, then yes, race is very much present in your life. It would have to be. Otherwise, you wouldn't be referring to your friends as all being the same race as you. And that wouldn't even make sense if we were truly in a post-racial society. So, Du Bois also discusses during his time period an area of the American South where there is a high concentration of African American population who were living in poverty and whose labor was being exploited, oftentimes through tenant farming. And this is not to say that all African Americans at this point in time were poor or tied to the land, because you had people like Ida Wells, who became one of the first millionaires ever, and she was a black woman. But just because, and this was in the early 1900s, but just because you have examples like that, we wouldn't turn around then and say that America 100 years ago was post-racial or post-sexism or anything along those lines, right? So there are always exceptions, but Du Bois talks about this area that he calls the Black Belt, and in the American South, where most people were tied to tenant farming and would have to go to landowners who were white former enslavers. In many cases, they would have to go to the people who had held them in bondage before the Civil War, and then they would get a tract of land to farm, and that's what's called tenant farming. Now, oftentimes, the white landowner would end up reaping all the benefits from the labor of the black family living in that area and leave very little left over for the black family just to eat, just to survive. And so living in dire economic conditions, and while providing most of the agricultural labor for the country during this time in this area. Now, another major concept that's important to understand with Du Bois is his concept of double consciousness. Double consciousness is something that we still hear discussed today. So when sociologists of race and ethnicity go out and talk with minority groups, we find double consciousness not just among African Americans, but other minority groups as well. And so we'll focus on just in terms of how Du Bois is talking about it in his time period. But think about that for a moment, that a book written in 1903, or published in 1903, you can produce hypotheses about race and ethnicity that still holds true today in 2020. That is deeply tragic. All right. What is double consciousness? It's the idea that of the universal subject that we've discussed, that you've probably heard in your other sociology classes even. The universal subject is the idea of, what do you think of when you think of as an American? Who do you picture? And I don't actually have to pull the class because we've had studies on this for years, and what people think of is a white man, heterosexual, if they're primed to think about sexuality and these kinds of things, Protestant Christian, cisgendered. So when we go through and look at that, that would be the universal subject for American, and anyone that does not fit somewhere on that is somehow not fully American. And so double consciousness is about being American and being black at the same time, and experiencing those two identities as though they were contradictory, because the mainstream society sees them as contradictory. And so it's where people feel, to use Du Bois' own language, it's where people feel like a stranger in their own home. That is double consciousness. Now, according to Du Bois as well, and you can see the start of a critical examination in terms of race and ethnicity of the criminal justice system in Du Bois, because he's talking about the ways that the criminal justice system is being used in his time period, and as we can see with, like, Michelle Alexander's quickly becoming classic analysis of race in the criminal justice system, the new Jim Crow. That this is something that, again, you can project, you can take this model and generate hypotheses, test those hypotheses, and they still remain valid today, are highly reliable today, I should say. Excuse me. So, Du Bois is looking at using things like black codes and pig laws, and laws that were on the books that would be just applied to African Americans. Now, you can see this also in today. Like, for instance, when you go to the police blotter online and you look at who's being arrested for what. Take, for example, walking in the streets. Now, there are poor parts here where we live in Beaumont, where there are no sidewalks, and people are either going to be walking in the grass and uneven terrain, where they risk, insects jumping on them, dirtying their clothes, slipping and falling in the wet, if it's wet, twisting their ankle in uneven terrain where they can't see because of the overgrowth, a hole in the ground, all of these sorts of things, or walk in the road. So driving around, when you drive around these areas, I've seen people of all races and ethnicities walking in the roads. But when you look at the people who are given citations for it, it's mainly African Americans and Latinos that you end up seeing getting citations. So you have a law on the books that supposedly applies to everyone, but only certain groups are getting punished for the law. And that's part of how racism gets written into the criminal justice system. Du Bois ends up beginning that analysis and pointing that out, that racial oppression is occurring through the criminal justice system in this way. All right. Now, the next person, the next theorist that we're going to look at, is George Simmel. Now, Simmel could be considered kind of in symbolic interactionism. He kind of does his own thing. He's loosely in symbolic interactionism. But in terms of his approach to social questions, in terms of his methodology, the school that he's a part of is anti-positivism. And so he's inherited this from Weber. You can see, and Simmel and Weber were actually friends. And this is sometimes thought of as being against science, but that's not exactly what anti-positivism means. It's more against thinking that you can reduce something as complex as society to its basic parts and then understand the society as a whole. So in many ways, anti-positivism is against over-reductionism or atomism, but at the same point in time, it also allows for more interpretive methodologies, more qualitative methodologies, for instance. And so in terms of answering social questions, he is an anti-positivist, Simmel is, just like his friend Weber. Now, one of Simmel came up with multiple character types. And one of the character types, the character type that was discussed in the readings, was someone who is held at arm's length in society, but at the same point in time, the society relies on the labor of the people, and they will oftentimes even ask for their advice on things because they're seen as an outsider and therefore someone who could offer advice that's not necessarily going to be biased to one group or another within society. And he calls this character type the stranger. Now, Simmel goes through and he identifies multiple character types, but one of the ones that gets cited the most often and has still a lot of explanatory power for things that we see occurring today in society is this concept of the stranger. Now, Simmel does believe that individuality is a real thing. He thinks that we do have individual characters that are not just coming from our social groups. Now, he's the only social theorist that we're looking at that thinks this. He's the only really major social theorist who thinks about this. And he means that people have a sense of a core self. Now, whether or not that core self is true or it's really singular instead of multiple, those are different questions. People have the experience of a fundamental core self that differs for some degree from the perceived self of others. And that is what he means by individuality. So even in that sense, he's not embracing an American notion of radical individuality. Now, as I said, Simmel and Weber, you see a lot of crossover between the two of them. And whereas Weber talks about ideal types as a way of thinking, a tool to think, Simmel means something very similar with his concept of generalized types. So Simmel says that the level of knowledge needed to actually know someone is impossible to achieve. You can never fully, truly, absolutely know someone. And because we can't get in each other's heads and read each other's thoughts. And you know, while we can imagine walking a mile in someone else's shoes, we can't actually walk that mile in someone else's shoes, literally. And so we only have a distorted view of others at best. And a lot of it is based on our own self-understanding. And so a lot of it is based on how well we understand ourselves and the projections we're making onto other people. And so oftentimes we project flaws that we see in ourselves onto other people, and we can't see it in ourselves, but we can see it very clearly in others. And so what we do is we create this notion of generalized types. Now, this generalized types can be used in a scientific sort of way, in the same way that Weber's ideal types can, and they're intended to be used in that way. If science is understood grounded within the philosophy of science, and not this monistic view of science as only experimentation and nothing else. So, generalized types is Simmel's word for this. Now, Simmel also is well known for discussing the old philosophical divide between form and content, and how form and content are related to one another. And he's talking about the interrelations between social interaction and social structure, and the way that social interactions reify and support the social structure, and the social structure in turn frames the social interactions. And so, in this sense, when he's looking at this, he has the understanding that there are different character types that enter into different kinds of sociability with other people, and so these sociabilities types can end up coming in many different forms. So you can have dominant and subordinate, you can have the exchange type, and these are all ways that social interaction ends up occurring in Simmel's framework. Now, this also, though, then provides the social structure in terms of who has which social location. So, for example, in subordination and domination, you can look at that between parents and children. You can look at that between employer and employee. You can go down the line and see how this ends up working out in forms of exchange in multiple areas. Now, also, according to Simmel, is that you can measure the degree, or the way that distinctions between social forms based on the amount of social distance. So, for instance, if there's a great deal of social distance between people because of, say, racism, for instance, and so people are working in different sectors of the economy and different types of jobs, and then when those jobs interact with one another, you can end up seeing the social distance playing out in the form of exchange or what have you, whatever social form ends up molding, framing that interaction. And so this is the amount of social space or distinction that is seen between two people. And this is social distance, not to be confused with social distancing, which we're all supposed to be doing while COVID-19 runs its course. All right, now let's move directly on to symbolic interactionism. Now, symbolic interactionism, the readings you have come from George Herbert Mead. Mead is the major figure within symbolic interactionism, but there's other major figures as well that who are important. Charles Horton Cooley is one that is important that we need to talk about. And Charles Horton Cooley comes up with the concept of the looking glass self. Now, the looking glass is just a 19th century, early 20th century way to refer to a mirror. All right, so he's kind of talking about the mirror self. But he doesn't necessarily mean it in the same way that, say, like Jacques Lacan means it. But for Charles Horton Cooley, the mirror self is that every other person, or the looking glass self, is that every other person acts as a kind of social mirror for every other person. So if you're walking down and people are giving you weird looks, you might go duck into a bathroom and look at yourself and to see why people are giving you weird looks. And if you find something that you're like, oh, that's why they're giving me a weird look, you most likely are going to change it about yourself. And so this is the way that people informally shape us, and that we informally shape others. Because as others are mirrors to us, we are mirrors to others too. And that's the looking glass self. That was by Charles Horton Cooley. Now, according to George Herbert Mead, we end up organizing interactions around significant symbols. Significant symbols are ways of non-verbally communicating information about the self, information about what groups we belong to. It's how we style ourselves, how we dress ourselves, things that are considered significant within our own culture that can then be read symbolically and link us to specific groups. So, significant symbols is a broad category that would include both material and non-material aspects of culture and the ways that we use these things to communicate. And they're symbols. Now, they might be functional, they might have a particular function for us, but their main purpose is symbolic communication. All right. Now, Mead also talks about different stages of social development, that we have to learn how to be social. And so he breaks down the stages that occur broadly in socialization in childhood. And he says the early stage is mimicry, or the imitation stage. And mimicry is the earliest stage of social development, where kids are just copying what they see others doing. Now, mimicry is one of the basic forms of learning, and we see this across many other species of animals, not just humans. And so it's the most simple way of learning, is copying what you see. And so these are really young children who are acting as sponges, and they're just absorbing everything that they see and then repeating it. So, the next stage entered into typically around the age of 3 or 4 is the play stage. The play stage is very important in social development. It's where kids are just starting to learn how to step into certain roles and then step out of those same roles. So the play stage is about playing with roles. Now, these could be really simple games like cops and robbers, or playing house, or any number of little make-believe games that older toddlers, pre-K kind of children end up playing. And what are they doing? They're not just always playing the same role typically over and over and over again. They take turns. And so one kid would play the cop, another kid would play the robber, for instance, and then they switch. What are they doing? Well, those roles come with certain social expectations, and those social expectations are then being learned, as well as the child understands them, through trying to act them out in a game. And so this is a very important part of socialization for children. Now, the last stage, we enter into the last stage fairly young, but we become more sophisticated with it as we grow older. We can enter into this stage before the age of 10, and that's the game stage. Now, the game stage is built on top of the play stage. This is where you add more roles that you're trying to keep track of. And keep in mind that as we get older, we become better at this and more sophisticated with it. So socialization doesn't stop just because we've entered the game stage. It's a lifelong experience. It never stops, especially as society and culture never stops and are constantly changing. So, in this sense, the game stage, Mead loves baseball, and so he uses baseball as his example for almost everything, as those of you who did the readings know. And so the game stage for him is being able to keep track of what's expected of your role and how the expectations of your role will change depending on the context and what's happening, and also keeping track of multiple different roles who all have different expectations put on them. So in the example of baseball, you have the pitcher. Well, the pitcher's not always a pitcher. Sometimes the pitcher's a batter. The pitcher has to respond differently to what's occurring in the game. The pitcher has to keep track of what the coaches are doing and saying, and the signals being given by the catcher, and what's going on with the people covering bases and the outfield, and they got to keep track of all of these different roles, but all those roles are having to keep track of all the other roles too. And so you can see it's actually amazing how complicated these kinds of social calculations can become, and our human brains are capable of crunching these data, so to speak, like that, oftentimes without even giving it a lot of conscious thought. It just speaks to how amazing our brains are. But that would be the game stage, where everything becomes much more complex in terms of how we're doing this. Now, Mead also breaks the self into three basic parts. The part of the self that is creative, that's ambitious, that is the unsocialized self, is called the I. Now, the I is also the source of motivation. It's the part of the self that acts in the moment. Now, one way to remember this is Mead is drawing from grammar here. So I is always the subject of a sentence. Me is always the object of the sentence. I did that. This happened to me, right? So the I does the action, the me receives action. He's using I and me as two different parts of self, and only because of their role in English grammar. All right, so keep that in mind. That's what he's doing. All right, so that leads us to the me then. The me is the socialized self. It's the me is the part of the self that has internalized the broader social roles in society. It's part of the self that is an observer. It's the you that judges yourself in memory and projecting yourself into the future, and it's also the internalization of the social rules and expectations of the different roles that you fulfill in whatever society you live in. Now, the last part is how we are all kind of like microcosms of our broader societies. And so this is called the generalized other. And so it's how we all carry our own cultures, our own societies with us in our heads no matter where we go. And so our own culture is always our first reference, even if we end up living in another culture. So the generalized other is how we perceive and understand how other people in our society in general think about things. Now, we don't have to have a perfectly good understanding, and we don't have a perfectly good understanding of what other people in our society are thinking, or how they're approaching things. Just like Zimmel said, you can't have perfect knowledge of another person, or you can't have perfect knowledge of your culture either. It's too complex. Even people who spend their entire life studying culture can't know everything in a given culture. So in this sense then, the generalized other is an imperfect perception of our society in general. Alright, next we're going to be moving on to the Frankfurt School. Alright, so two of the biggest founders and contributors to the Frankfurt School were Horkheimer and Adorno. Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. Now, they were considered foundational members of the Frankfurt School. It also, the Frankfurt School is a major part of the broader theoretical movement of critical theory. But for the Frankfurt School is not the only example of critical theory. Gramsci's is a major part of critical theory, and he's not a part of the Frankfurt School at all. He was part of the Italian school. So, according to Horkheimer and Adorno, modern capitalistic societies' cultures are mass-produced, and they're mass-produced to make a profit. And so they coined the term the culture industry. And so the cultural products that are produced by the culture industry are calculated to make the most money possible. Now, because of that, they will develop profit-driven formulae of what will work, what kinds of themes in a movie will work, or in a show, or even in a novel that becomes popular. And you can reduce this to a basic formula. Then you end up getting a lot of very similar kinds of stories being told over and over and over again. Like you can see the hero's quest as one model of storytelling or type of story, and you can see the hero's quest and the growth of the hero in Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. You can just go down the line, and you can see the same thing, the same theme playing out time and time again in culture, because it plays well. People enjoy watching that story over and over and over again. You just have to swap out the details, tell the same story, and you end up getting a decent chunk of profit off of it. But what this does is it homogenizes culture, and it decreases the diversity of cultural expression. And so that was one of their biggest critiques of it, is homogenization. They see the culture industry leads to homogenization. Now, Horkheimer and Adorno also have a particular critique of film. They see film as blurring the lines between fantasy and reality. It's not that they think people can't tell the difference between fantasy and reality. It's that people come to prefer the fantasy and then use the fantasy as a measure to judge their own lives and lived experiences. So have you ever, what happens more often? People are sitting watching a movie and go, wow, yeah, that's like something that happened in my real experience. Yeah, sometimes people will do that. But is it more common to hear people experience something in their day-to-day lives and say, whoa, that was just like in this show I saw, or just like in this movie? What are they using as their way of judging their lived experience? They're using the culture industry. And so, in this sense, they have a strong critique of film. Not that they think film inherently is bad, but that film as produced by the culture industry ends up reducing the complexity of human experiences. All right. Now, Horkheimer and Adorno also argue that the culture industry creates assembly line-like standardization of cultural products in order to better predict returns on investments. They also, the culture industry does something that had never happened before in human history, as far as we're aware anyway, and that is that they separated cultural producers and cultural consumers into separate groups. Those who produce culture and those who consume culture. Those in the past were the same people, the producers and consumers. You think about an oral society based on oral traditions, and those oral traditions get passed down, but the people who are telling the stories, they heard from older generations, and they put their own spin on it, their own parts to it. That's how you can study, say, for instance, Greek mythology, and Greek mythology changes wildly across the centuries. It's because people are putting their own spin on things, and that's even, I mean, that's a literate society. That's not even talking about oral traditions, though Greek mythology, if you go far enough back, starts in oral traditions, obviously, as all these traditions do. Also, the culture industry teaches ideology in subtle ways through entertainment. So you're being entertained, but you're getting ideological messages, such as ideological messages about how labor is supposed to function in society. So the cartoon, a bee movie, where labor should be happy to be exploited. In this case, the labor of bees being exploited in the form of humans taking their honey. I mean, this is a way of entertaining people, and especially children, but also teaching ideology. Or you look at most of Disney's films in the past, though you can certainly see that the ideology is becoming more complex now. In the past, the Disney movies were always the same, about gender relations, the same ideology. Women can't solve their own problems. They are victims, and they need this knight in shining armor to come and rescue them. Wash, rinse, and repeat with just different details, and you have most Disney movies. Though, for you Disney fans out there, I know that doesn't characterize all of them. All right. I'm sure many of you can point out the exceptions that demonstrate the overall pattern I'm talking about, though. All right. Let's turn our attention to another major figure in critical theory, Antonio Gramsci's. Now, he's not a part of the Frankfurt School. He wasn't a part. He famously did his most influential work in prison because he was under the fascistic government of Mussolini. He was a Marxist, a critical theorist. Critical theory in general was highly influenced by the thinking of Marx and Weber as well. And so the fascistic government of Mussolini, just as the fascistic government of Hitler did, rounded up most of the Marxists that they could find and locked them up. And so Gramsci had not actually committed any crimes or any offense, even by the Italian penal code. So the prosecutor in Gramsci's case told the judge, or the jurist, not the judge, different legal system, told the jurist, basically, we need to lock Gramsci up, and I quote, to stop his mind from working for a period of time. They just wanted to shut him up, and so they put him behind bars. But he had this elaborate system where he was able to get his ideas out. And so his most influential work is the Prison Notebooks. That's what it's called, the Prison Notebooks. And your readings actually come from the Prison Notebooks. Now, Gramsci also uses a term that many of you may be unfamiliar with, syndicalism. Syndicalism is kind of this idea of using collective and organized political, or doing collective, organized political action through labor. And so this could be, labor unions, through labor unions, or what have you. But he's definitely seeing this through Marxian theory as a way of labor taking on the means of production, taking control of also the political economy more generally. Now, Gramsci also uses the concept of praxis as a major part of his work in general. And you may recall from when we were first talking about Marx that praxis is theory in action. That's what praxis is. It is an application of theory as ideology to change society, to challenge other ideologies, dominant ideologies, mainstream ideologies, what have you. Now, we also see that Gramsci ends up dividing up society as structure and superstructure. This is very similar to Marx's notion of means of production and mode of production. And so, in this sense, then, the structure would be the very foundation of society. That would be the means of production. This would be how things are produced, the commodities that are produced, the tools that are used to produce the commodities, the relation of labor to the forces of production more generally, and versus the superstructure, which serves much more ideologically. And so this is ideological boundaries on society that also justify structuring a society the way it's structured. And so these are the overarching mainstream or dominant ideologies that are actually put into effect and as a kind of praxis in and of themselves. So, now the sector of society that maintains allegiance to particular ideological beliefs across generations, according to Gramsci's, would be things like education systems, family structure, religion, and Gramsci calls that civil society. Civil society, as opposed to political society, which is much more obviously governmental. Gramsci also did not coin this term, but he does define it, redefine it in a way that is used now generally in sociology. And that's hegemony. Hegemony. You'll find it in your key terms and concept list. Hegemony is when something becomes so ubiquitous or so ever-present, it's all over the place, that's what ubiquitous means, that it's no longer even noticed, and therefore becomes incredibly powerful because it's almost operating in the background. And so a lot of dominant ideologies will oftentimes work in the background so that people are not even aware that they're acting on certain ideologies, or they're reifying through their behavior, through their actions, particular dominant ideologies that if they stopped and thought about them critically, they might not actually agree with, but they're still acting them out without much thought. Now, while Gramsci was highly influenced by Marx, he was also critical of Marx and was not just an unthinking, unquestioning follower of Marx by any stretch of the imagination. And his criticism of Marx is in terms of what's generally been labeled economism. Now, we can see this in terms of Weber as well, and I talked about this when we were discussing Weber, because Weber also has a similar critique of Marx, that Marx ends up reducing all complex social and cultural phenomena as being outcroppings of the economy, or the political economy, as more specifically. Because remember, Marx doesn't see a distinction between economics and politics, he sees them as being one and the same thing. Gramsci's was also, and repeats this criticism of Marx, of economism. All right. Next, we're going to go on to a French example of critical theory and a structural Marxist. So we can see here how there's a kind of a combination of structural analysis, structural functionalism, and conflict theory in the structural Marxists. And the example that you have for your readings is coming from Louis Althusser. Now, Louis Althusser, as I said, is coming from the school of structural Marxism. All right. If we want to get technical, so's Gramsci. He's an Italian example of a structural Marxist. Now, Althusser referred to institutions and social systems, such as education systems, criminal justice systems, as being parts of the ideological state apparatuses. And ideological state apparatuses are those systems that use their power over people's lives to enforce conformity to dominant ideologies. And so, for the instance, with the educational system, it's teaching ideologies, the dominant ideologies. Or you can do this especially with the teaching of history, and how you can't teach everything in history. Right? So there's always going to be a selection bias. And so then the question becomes, how are you selecting what parts of history you teach and what parts of history you leave out? Well, that selection is coming from the dominant ideology. And so by the very selection of what you teach and what you don't teach, you are also teaching particular ideological perspectives. And this is opposed to repressive state apparatuses. Repressive state apparatuses would be the police, the military, those groups that will directly get involved if you end up violating the dominant ideologies in what their society considers an egregious manner. All right, now how do repressive state apparatuses maintain their power through ideology? It's in the creation of the subject, and Althusser calls this interpellation. Interpellation, it's in your key concepts and terms list. It's interpellation. Interpellation. It's where in the readings he's talking about a police officer saying, hey, you, to someone. That calling out of someone is calling forth their subjectness to the authority of the state as represented by the police officer. A way to think about it is, think about this. You're driving along and you're not thinking about your speed. You're in your own head, you're listening to music, but you're not thinking about how fast you're going. And then all of a sudden you see the red and blue lights behind you in your rearview mirror. What's your initial emotional reaction? For most people, it's frustration, maybe a little fear. Your stomach might drop. Oh no, is this going to be a ticket? How fast was I going? I wasn't looking. And you might first look at your speedometer to see exactly how fast you're going, so you can try to figure out how big the ticket's going to be. But that emotional expression, that feeling of, oh no, I'm in trouble, I'm about to face potential punishment, that is you experiencing yourself no longer as yourself, but as subject to the power of a state. Because before the police lights went off, you were in your own head thinking about your own things, right? All right. Next, and I know I am flying through this stuff like crazy. I'm actually thinking about some of my colleagues who are critical theorists who, if they ever watched this video, they'd be pulling their hair out, screaming, "Oh my God, Garrick, you're oversimplifying this stuff." It's like, all right. On the off chance that they ever do watch one of these videos, this is a review for an exam, and you do this with your own students. All right. Now we're going to turn our attention to another member of the Frankfurt School, another member of critical theory, and that's Walter Benjamin. Benjamin also escaped Nazi Germany and was very much interested in the relationship between politics and arts. And his influential essay, which you were assigned to read, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, picks up the history of art after what is referred to as the crisis of representation. The crisis of representation occurred in the 19th century in the West and refers to the invention of the camera specifically. Now you think about how artists, before the invention of the camera, ended up supporting themselves, typically by doing realistic portraits of wealthy benefactors. And then they would go and do other art, their more artistic expression on their own time, paid for by doing the portrait business. Now, what happens with the invention of the camera is that it stops the demand, or slows the demand for paintings, portraits of people. And so this has a corresponding effect where art becomes progressively more abstract. And so the crisis of representation is kind of an identity crisis within art itself. Of, well, what is art then? How far can we push this boundary of art? And but Benjamin says that politics ends up having a big impact on this. And so, for instance, he famously ends his essay with the one of his famous quotes that communism turns art into politics. And so you can think after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the October Revolution, when V.I. Lenin becomes one of the most powerful Russians at the time. And Lenin oversaw this artistic movement showing, workers, agricultural workers, with a hammer and sickle moving forward into a bright Russian future, bright Soviet future. Lenin never could have known that Stalin was going to steal the country, but he did. So, communism turns art into politics, like the Workers United posters and things like that. However, fascism turns politics into art. So he's thinking of Hitler, for instance, and Hitler does this famous art show in Berlin where he ends up changing the titles of abstract art to things like "the Jew is deformed," these really anti-Semitic and offensive kinds of things. And it's all to illustrate his fascistic ideology, that this abstract art and are simply evidence of the decadence and decay of Western civilization that he's going to bring back. And you could see that the politics that were going on were more theatrical, more theater. I mean, the Nazis were going to do whatever the Nazis were going to do once they solidified their power. Now, they may have been democratically elected into their positions, but once they solidified their power, the politics that they engaged in for the public was merely it was merely theater. It was merely to assure the public of everything's going great. Yes, it doesn't matter that, we've lost the Vichy government in France, and Americans and Soviets are marching on Berlin. We will be victorious, right? These kind of messages being put out. So Benjamin's statement is that communism turns art into politics, fascism turns politics into art. And so you look at politics, the world of politics, and you look at the world of art. If politics is acting more like theater, that's evidence that you're living in a fascistic culture. If the art that your society is producing is highly political in general, then that's a sign you're living in a communistic society of some sort. All right. Now, Benjamin is also critical of what Horkheimer and Adorno called the culture industry. And when he's talking about the age of mechanical reproduction, he's talking about how people don't typically interact with original art. People typically interact with reproductions of the art. So while many people have gone to the Louvre and seen like the Mona Lisa in the art museum, that doesn't mean that most people have. Most people have never seen the actual Mona Lisa. But most of us have seen posters of it. Most of us have seen representations of it. We've seen it replicated in art history books. We've seen it changed in pop culture, where you see Homer Simpson as Mona Lisa and things along those lines. And what ends up happening when people are inundated with these mechanical reproductions of works of art is they come to prefer the mechanical reproductions. Just like Horkheimer and Adorno's critique of film, where people come to prefer the fantasy over their lived experience. It's the same kind of thing with this. But Ben-Hameen talks about it as a loss of aura, that the original artwork has this kind of aura about it, typically. And when you had to travel to go and see art, only the wealthy were able to see it. So mechanical reproduction does democratize the experience of art, but people come to prefer the cleaned up, sanitized version. When you see the actual Mona Lisa, it's tiny, it's dingy, it's dark, it's dirty, it's old. And you typically can't even see it because the crowd surrounding it are so large that you can't even get close enough to it to see it. So people end up using their phones and zooming in on it. So they travel all this way and then they're still looking at a replication of it on the phone instead of the authentic thing. And then they're typically disappointed because it's lost its aura. We've seen too many reproductions of it. And so we've come to prefer the reproduction over the original. All right. Just to let you know also, do not be tricked. I sometimes will ask questions where the question's asked, the answer is the same to another question, but I'm asking it in a slightly different way, just to see if you understand more of the complexity. So if you come to a question, you're like, wait a minute, didn't I answer something similar to this just a minute ago? Don't second guess yourself. I might be asking for the same concept again, all right? And just looking at whether or not you understand a different aspect of it. So that concludes our exam review. And everyone stay safe, stay healthy, and I will be talking with you virtually next time. If there are any questions, any issues, any problems, just shoot me an email. All right. Until next time, theory students.